Hey everybody, it's John from Denarii Games, and in this week's episode we're going to go through, um, what we did with the Crafter Station entity. There was some feedback in Discord on, how'd you pull that off. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time documenting that, and then show some improvements that we've made since, in the last week. Before we do that, let's go ahead and look at, the stock kit, which we kind of see in this inset, the default. So there's a couple concepts. The first entity here is your normal workbench entity. You can craft items. You define the recipe for these items directly on the workbench itself. And if you have the ingredients, then of course you can craft it. You're going to notice that every single one of these has a single ingredient because that's the way it's set up. So something like that. So the next example is the queued workbench. If I pull that up, this now uses the concept of recipes, and now you can have multiple ingredients, and you also get to choose how many of these things you want. So I want one of these like this, 2 wood, 2 stone. I'm going to get a bow out, hit craft, and after a period of time, it will give me the bow. So this is the queued workbench. So the last thing we'll show is the campfire. So the campfire has storage, and these all have storage underneath the hood, but this then requires me to add in a component to turn it on. So if I pull up my inventory and I'm going to drag some wood over here, deposit that, we'll deposit 2 of those. I can now turn this on, and I can also craft things by dragging in items into the storage and converting them over. So because it's just like a regular workbench in that way. So those are the 3 concepts. If I go look at now our code, I've got this thing that I've created called the Crafter Station entity. And let's go and pull that up. All right, great. So just like with any other of these entities, you're adding them to a building. And I'm inheriting from campfire entity here. That means that all the code inside the kit that's looking for a campfire entity when you're interacting with it and that sort of thing, the crafter station entity will work exactly the same. And if I made no other changes, then my crafter station entity would be nothing more than a renamed campfire entity. But I've also added in here some of the workbench settings. So here's the queued workbench entity. If I pull that up, let's put these things side by side so we can see them. Like so, we'll see in my my campfire that I'm deriving from with my crafter station entity, I have pretty much the same workbench settings that you see from the queued workbench. In fact, they're exactly the same. So I've just copied over what was in queued workbench. So there's all the settings, there's my sync fields. We'll skip it over crafter station for a second. We have down here activatable, and the rest of this again is identical. So all I've done is copied over what was inside of this queued workbench entity. I've added it to this new entity, and I've also added in another class we're driving from, iCrafting QSource, which is the same as this. And both the queued workbench entity and the campfire entity inherit from building entity, so I don't need to add that one. So what are these other ones? These are also net new here. You won't need them unless you want to kind of build the same thing I did. I added in more settings on top of the campfire entity and on top of the queued workbench entity called crafter station settings. So I've got this thing called require fire to use. It's a Boolean. Not every single crafter station is going to require fire, obviously. So think like an alchemy table or something like that. We have require equipped items to use. This is a new enum. I'll look at the code so you can see what it means. But do we want to have these items equipped to be able to use this crafting station? So think something like, I need a smithing hammer if I'm going to use the forge, something like that. And then we look at finally, whatever other equipped items that we might have that are required. So all of that is net new, and this is what is inside of this crafter station entity. So let's take a look at the enum, which I just referenced. There's something called any all. It's pretty simple. This is just a convenience for being able to select any or all of the required items. Not much code to it, but that's it. So what else did I have to do to pull this off and get this to work? Let's kind of work backwards here. So inside of this particular partial, which is a partial on the player character building component, this is where I'm going to extend the logic. In fact, I'm going to bypass the normal call server turn on, which is about the campfire. In this case, I've got my own function called call server turn on crafting station. And it started life looking exactly like the campfire one, but now I've added in my own logic. We call this particular function through a UI button, but the idea here is now that I'm calling my function instead. This is kind of boilerplate up top, and then finally we kind of get into my logic where I'm looking for equipped items here. So we're looking at saying if there are any of the equipped items are defined. Then we are going to go loop through and see if that item is actually equipped by the user of this particular um, crafting station. And that user is because it's coming off the component player character building. It's the player itself that's using the item, so I can pull up what the items they have equipped. And we're just going to do a simple comparison. This logic right here branches out if I have any or all. So if I'm requiring all, then as soon as I don't have an item, then it's going to go false. And if it's any, then as soon as I have an item, then it defaults to true. And then finally, I do an RPC. Again, this is just like the normal campfire. I'm calling my own function now. Instead of server turn on campfire, it's server turn on crafter station. This is all kind of the same boilerplate. And ultimately, we're going to turn that on, which is just like the campfire. So all this logic that you see inside of this player character building component has to do with the custom logic for do you have something equipped that you need to use the station. Let's see what else I have here that will be useful to know. So if I go into this character controller here, this is also a partial. And we're going to call, every time you activate a building, I'm going to pass in on the on activate, and we need to now handle this crafter station entity, right? Because normally it only handle, the campfire or the queued workbench. So in this case, it's going to handle if it's a crafter station. And when I turn on the crafter station, which is going to be just the first part of the UI, which is the logic for adding in the fuel items, I'm also going to do this here. I'm also going to turn on the queue items dialog, because those had separately been two separate things, and the kit treats them as two separate things. I don't want to change any of that logic. I don't want to have to unwind any of it. So it's still two separate things. You have part of the UI, which is the fuel mechanism, which comes from the campfire, and then you have the other part of the UI, which is the actual queue for the workbench. So when we turn on a crafter station entity, that is, we're interacting with that thing that's derived from the campfire. We're also at the same time going to turn on queue items. So that's kind of required for both of them to pop up at the same time. The last thing we see here is the UI. And in this UI, there's a whole bunch of things that I've done to try to customize my own thing. I don't think any of this is necessarily required, except for this little function right here, which is on click turn on workbench. This is what's calling what we saw earlier in the player building component, right? Call server. So this is now saying call server. So this is a function that is attached to the new on-click button for igniting or turning on that particular crafter station. So this is required to call the player character building component part of the function. The rest of this is just kind of UI stuff. What I mean by that is, setting names of things and stuff like that. So that's basically it for code. There's not a whole lot of code that's custom, like I said in the last video. Let's go ahead and take a look at the UI, because setting this up did take some trial and error. So this is the default Canvas Gameplay Mobile, so you can kind of get your frame of reference. If I go under UI Dialogs Mobile here and scroll all the way down to UI Crafting Layout, the first part's this little button here that says Crafting. The second part's the actual UI. This is what comes up when when you're interacting with that queued workbench, right? This is your workbench queue. So this is the part that you're actually turning on whenever you're interacting with the crafting station, which is again deriving from the campfire. So we're actually turning this on here in code. And then you have, secondly, the campfire dialog. And this is the part that has the storage for the campfire with the turn on, turn off type of logic. So inside of here, you're going to see UI campfire items. UI campfire items. We're replacing this entirely. We're replacing this with the customization that I'd done earlier. UI crafter station items. UI crafter station items derives from UI campfire items, so we're going to get rid of UI campfire items and use this one instead. And this is then going to expose that on click button. That on click button, if you kind of come down here and look inside of info and you see button turn on, we're going to replace the reference here, right? Instead of calling UI campfire items, we're calling our own, and instead of on click turn on, we're going to on click turn on the crafter station. So that's basically the customization that has to be done. If we take a look at my example, you'll notice that I no longer have the campfire UI. It's deleted, or actually moved. It's moved out. And we have the crafting layout, just like we saw before. There's the button crafting, which of course I can turn back on. There's a little black button there. And here's my crafting layout. So I've redone the UI since the last video to look a little bit different, but basically the same idea. So we have the item craft formulas. That's not changed at all. We've got the crafting queue items. The way it looks, of course, changes, but that hasn't changed at all. We have inside the window a whole bunch of stuff, which we'll drag into. But then I've added in the crafter station items. So this is what you actually enable, right? This is what you actually enable when you interact with the crafter station. It turns this on. And this in turn, when this turns on, it turns on the window below it and everything below it. So that's how we got it both to work at the same time. And the crafter station items, again, is, if I go kind of through here, we've got there's the content. So my content is down here. So I've kind of put it stuck inside the header of this thing. So it's got the title of what it is. It says campfire or forge, whatever. The content, this little thing, is where you drag your wood into. And then everything down kind of below is where, outside the header, inside the content, is where the actual formulas and that sort of thing live. So again, the logic of it hasn't changed. The presentation, the way it looks, of course, has changed, but the logic of it has not changed at all. So let's take a look again at my implementation. And last week I've added a few things which I'll call out. So one of the things we started to do last week is refactor the UI. I think I decided to go a little bit of a different direction, I think. Really, focusing on trying to minimize, and I'm not even entirely happy with this, but I felt the other thing we had done was a little bit too heavy, and so I want to try to keep it as minimal as possible. So there we go, we placed our campfire. We'll go ahead and now use this campfire. We'll see, the way we did the recipes looks a little bit different as we refactor the UI. We're pulling in things like the skill that's required, because we now have, for every recipe now can require a skill. I should probably show that. So if I come look at my items under data and under item craft items, and if I go look at, like, for example, garlic steak here, we'll see now kind of the base item, but now we have a required skill, which I've added in. I've also added required equipped items, which I don't necessarily have to have, but each individual recipe can also require a different item to be equipped. So this is saying that you need a cooking skill of 5. Cooking skill 5 shows there, and then over here it kind of summarizes and says, yep, I've got the resources, I've got the red meat and the garlic, but I don't have a cooking skill of 5. Then we can kind of combine that with the item itself. So if I go equip this particular pan, this pan gives me a bonus to my cooking skill. So that's a way of basically not having to make a requirement, but encouraging certain kind of play behavior. I'm not going to require the pan, but if you do have a pan, then you get better cooking skill. So now I could cook that garlic steak as example, and that's defined just by improving the skill within the item itself. So if I come down here to items and tools and frying pan, see down here, it's increasing skill levels and it's increasing my cooking by 5. So that's kind of default kit behavior. We also have this cool thing where I now have a pan equipped, which I think is super cool because, when I was a kid, watching movies where, the unexpected hitting in the head with a frying pan was always kind of fun. So there we go. I can beat people now with a frying pan. More players can. So that's how that works there, is we've got, this ability to have requirements. And if I go look at, for example, the honey mead, then I don't have the honey, and I don't have the cooking skill of 10, so I can't make that one. So that's the improvements we did this week on the recipes. I also started to look at how I would interact with this fire itself. And last week I said we'd work on some animations. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that. So let me go ahead and open this up again. And we can drag some wood over that. We'll drag a couple pieces of wood over. And I've got to go ahead and now equip my Iron Striker. We did some custom modeling there, as well as some custom animation work. And the way I decided to do this was to use weapon ability, which means that it's now tied to a right click. If I go ahead and look at that Iron Striker, we can see over here, it has a special, it's a special weapon type, and it has a special weapon ability called Ignite Fire. And what's that look like? If I go ahead and right click now, you can see it works, plays the animation, which is now a skill animation, plays a funny sound because I didn't replace that, and that's how we work with the Iron Striker. And because of that, I actually removed, even though in the demo that I showed you guys is turn on, turn off, I removed that entirely. If you're going to turn it on, then you're going to equip an Iron Striker and flint and start the fire that way. So that's basically it. Now that that fire is going, the craft button's lit up. I can actually craft things. So if I go ahead and re-equip the pan now, I can go ahead and craft that delicious garlic steak. And there it is, shows up under consumables. That's it this week. Have a good one.